The book of Revelation has the reputation of being the strangest and sometimes most intimidating and frightening book of the Bible. I've had this conversation many times in the last few months where folks would say, I just didn't even want to read it, right? They just look at it and start getting into it, and it would be pretty terrifying as soon as you get into chapter 6, 7, and after that it can get odd. So hopefully through this series we've realized that it's actually not meant to freak us out or scare us or otherwise unsettle us. It's actually a book of grace and peace. It's been given to us to minister faith and life to us, to teach us about God and the world and the gospel and the victory of Jesus throughout the cosmos. So and the apocalyptic literature, the way that it's written, can be unsettling if we don't know what to do with it. But hopefully the last few months we've learned a little bit more of what to do with it. So in the book of Revelation we meet John, who is the author, and he has a vision of Jesus, and Jesus speaks to him and gives him 7 oracles for the 7 churches of Asia Minor. We realize that John was then invited in to have a look into the throne room of God. He's given this vision of behind the scenes spiritually, the spiritual realms, and has this incredible experience of the throne room of God, where we realize God is creator of everything. Every molecule that exists, God created. And we're told that God is also the savior of all that is, so he redeems and reconciles. As we've been going through, we've been realizing that Revelation doesn't work like a newspaper report. It's not a crystal ball. It's not a history book. It's something different. It's apocalyptic literature. It's written in that genre, and so it's full of symbols and numbers and parodies. It has a strange shape to it. It keeps cycling back on itself. It doesn't go in a linear calendar fashion. So there's all these different things to learn and to remember as we move through it. And this morning what we're going to do, though, is have a look. We're going to have a glimpse at the ending. But the ending is actually a new beginning. So it doesn't stop. It's the launch of the new. And we get to see the first little glimpse of that, and it's fascinating and beautiful. So we'll read through chapter 21, and as we go, I'll just stop and do a little bit of commentary on it. And hopefully by the time we're through, we've got a little bit more food for thought, and then we can receive the sacraments together. So Revelation chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. Okay, I'll stop there just to clarify. When he says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, all the way through, the theme is, it's not an issue of that the old heaven and the old earth have been crumpled up, thrown away, and then replaced. The vision that we have in the theology throughout the Gospels and throughout Revelation is not a replacement theology, it's a renewal theology. So when he says, I see a new heaven and a new earth, he doesn't mean that the old ones have been discarded. It means that what has always been has now been renewed. It's been healed. It has experienced the resurrection power of Jesus, as it talks about in Romans chapter 8 very clearly. It talks about how that very power will be applied to creation. And so it's not replacement, it's renewal. And when he says there's no more sea, I don't think that so much means there's no more ocean, but rather, when he says there's no more sea, the sea for the Hebrews, like I've mentioned, is the place of fear, where you have no control. It's a place where the monsters, wherever is terrifying comes from the sea. That was their theology. That was their culture. And so when John says there's no more sea, it doesn't mean there's no more oceans. It just means there's nothing to fear anymore. There's no more reason to be scared anymore. So he continues on and he says, I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people. And he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And he will wipe every tear from their eyes. And there will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. This beautiful vision that John has that he's trying to describe to us, and as he does it, he's trying to describe the indescribable. He's trying to explain to us something that really can't be properly explained. And so he uses a mixture of different metaphors and images to try and communicate to us what is going on. The first thing to notice is that the vision of the end that we're given is not an evacuation. It's not when all the people or God's people are gathered and then evacuated off somewhere else. This is an arrival. It is when the holy city, God's presence, the New Jerusalem, Zion, it's called all these different things. When that comes from the heavens to the earth, it's the arrival of God upon the earth, and now we're told God's dwelling place is now with us. It's not that we've been evacuated off, it's that God has now come. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth. It's the answer to the Lord's Prayer in the most extraordinary way. So John uses these different images and descriptions to try and help us get what he's talking about. He says it's a city, it's a New Jerusalem. So he identifies it as a place. As a place, somewhere, we are creatures of time and space, and so we need place. And John says, yes, it is this city. It's new, it's extraordinary, and then in a little minute he tries to describe it to us. It's not only a place, it's also a people, because he says it's like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And so this is the image all the way through the New Testament of the church. The church is the bride of Christ, the community of God's people. The church isn't a building or a place. The church is a community. It's people. It's God's society. So he's saying, well, it's a place, but it's also a people. But then he goes on a little bit further and he says it's the presence. He says, now we see God, and God's dwelling place is with us, and we will be his people, and he will be with us. And there's this beautiful intimacy moment of God parenting us when he says he'll wipe away every tear from our eyes. He doesn't just say, you'll stop crying. He says, no, God will actually wipe away the tears. He uses that imagery of, we know what it's like when a parent and when the little child falls over and cuts their knees, and there's tears, and as a parent, what do? You help wipe away the tears, right? There's this beautiful image that's used of God parenting his people, and to say to us, look, there's no more need to cry anymore. For whatever reasons we have been crying, the tears have been there, and there's a million reasons throughout history why hearts have been broken and tears have been cried. It's like the Lord is saying, okay, that's all over now. You don't need to cry anymore. It's different here. It's different now, and God's presence is with us, and there's this nearness. So John is trying to explain to us this is a place, a real place. He's also explaining to us it's about the people, and he's explaining to us it's about God's presence with the people in the place. So it's almost like he's tumbling over his own metaphors and descriptions to try and help us understand what it is he's seeing. We continue on in verse 5, and he says, he who is seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. I am making all things new. Now you notice that he doesn't say, I am making all new things. He doesn't say I'm making a new everything. He says I am making everything new. So there's this sense of it being a new creation. And that bounces us back to when Paul talks to the church in Corinth, and he is speaking about us, and he says, if anyone is in Christ, if our hearts and our lives have been turned Godward, and we've yielded to God to say yes, he says, if that's who you are now a new creation. He uses the very same language. You're a new creation. Now, that doesn't mean that the old us has been crumpled up, thrown away, and we've been replaced by something brand new. No, it means that we continue on. There's continuity, but there's now a grace and a miracle and a blessing in God's presence. We are being made new. We are being renewed. So John takes that exact same theology and the same language of Revelation and applies it on top of the theology of Paul in other parts when he writes to Corinth to reinforce this idea that sometimes we have, that everything will be just, incinerated and it will be discarded. And no, it won't, because when God created it, he said, I see it and it's good, but it's broken. But now there's a healing and it is made new. Continues on, says, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Okay, so he says something that we've just sung. He says, I am the beginning and the end. the Alpha and the Omega. We sang that a moment ago. You are the beginning and the end. Now, this takes us right back to chapter 1, when Jesus describes himself to John, and he uses the same phrase. He says the beginning and the end. Now, this is a brilliant way of God's self-disclosure. The word beginning is the word archon, which means the source, the architect, the archetype, the fountain, the reason for everything. When he says I'm the beginning, he means that everything has its beginning in me. I am the source of all things, God is saying. And he says I am the end, and the word there is telos, meaning I am the destiny of all things. I am the place where everything is now consolidated and resolved and realized and brought to its fullness. So he's not saying I am the start and the stop. He's saying I am the source and the destiny. Paul says, Romans 11, for from him and through him and back to him are all things. It's the same theology. He is the beginning and the end, the archon and the telos. Okay. To those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all the liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. That is the second death. Ouch. Okay, what just happened? We were enjoying a beautiful imagination of something magnificent, weren't we? And then suddenly we are ambushed with this dreadful image of judgment. What do we do with it? We can't cut and paste the paragraph out. We have to reckon with it. So what do we do with this sobering and somewhat terrifying prospect? Well, the fiery lake, the lake of fire, the word can also be, instead of lake, you can use marsh. It's like a marshland, a wasteland. That's the image given. It's seen definitely as a place of judgment and consequence. That's a straightforward part of it, judgment and consequence. But let me offer three understandings that have been a part of the church conversation for the last 2,000 years. So this isn't something new. This has been around since the very first church leaders wrestled with this possibility. How do we understand it? What does it mean? I guess the best question to ask is, how does this fiery lake serve the purposes of God? How does it serve the purposes of God? That's I think the best question to ask about this. Okay, so there's three versions. Three understandings. Let me give you very quickly the three. Now, these are all thought by and understood by godly Christian scholars, right? They're good people trying to do good theology, but they all have different opinions. And so I'll let you know what they are. The first idea or understanding is one that would be an actual place, a literal eternal consequence. That for those who harden their hearts against God, they pay this dreadful and eternal price. There's a consequence attached to it, and the lake of fire is exactly what it says it is. And this has been the dominant view in the West. We're part of the Western church tradition, not the Eastern. That's a different story, but I won't talk about that right now. The Western church tradition, of which we're a part, this has been the primary dominant view ever since Augustine, basically, ever since the 400s. Augustine has cast a very long shadow over the church in many ways. This is one of them. So the first understanding of this is that it's a literal, actual place, and it does exactly what it sounds like. The second understanding, though, is different from that. And again, other godly thinkers have various ideas, and they would say, no, that it's not a place of eternal consequence, it's a place of annihilation, where whatever goes in there is gone. It is consumed. It is comprehensively, disappears, basically. It is utterly consumed and turned to nothingness. And so the lake serves the purpose of God by consuming and removing all that is evil or rebellious against the purposes of God. That's the second view, called the annihilation view. A third view that runs parallel with those two starting mostly in the writings of Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, early church fathers, would be called Christian universalism. And this would be the understanding that there is a Christ-centered and atonement-necessary vision of what this means, and that the lake is more symbolic of the dreadful and fierce love of God that consumes like a fire. And they would appeal to the letter of Hebrews, where it says our God is a consuming fire. They would appeal to Paul, where he says we are saved as through fire. And the idea would be that the fire of God's love, his fierce judgment, would consume all that is not lovely. All that is rebellious, all that is evil would be consumed, but that which is good and eternal and right would be saved and would make it through. So it's definitely still a place of judgment and consequence, but there's also hope and redemption. So those are basically the three main streams of thought that have been around for the last couple of thousand years. And like I said, all proposed with different places of Scripture that are appealed to and different kinds of theology that are built upon them. So those are what they are. And I will, because in Revelation, everything isn't always as it seems, right? So it's good to get a bit more of a perspective from people who have thought more deeply about it. The other little interesting aside to this is some people are really, really dogmatic when it comes to some of these ideas and opinions. And I understand that, but for this particular conversation about, for example, the lake of fire, only until modern times, only very recently has this become an issue of orthodoxy. For the vast majority of church history, this was never an issue of orthodoxy. Various opinions were totally legitimate, and everybody would be fine to give each other the room to find a different conclusion on this. In the last couple of generations, it's become much more an issue of orthodoxy. Again, that is what it is. That's out of my control and your control. But it's an interesting modern twist to a very old and important conversation. Okay, let's move on from the lake of fire and get back to the slightly brighter side of the book. One of the 7 angels who had 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues came and said to me, "Come and I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Again, the ascending. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. Right, so what he tries to do now is describe to us this city, which is a place, but it's also a community, and it's also about God's presence, and it's ascending from the heavens to the earth, and he's trying to put together a description. And what he does, we find really quickly, is he locks right into the Old Testament apocalyptic toolbox to try and bring out the best descriptions to help us understand what it is he is trying to see and trying to explain. And remember, things in Revelation, everything is real, not everything is literal, so those rules apply here when we look at the description of the city. Otherwise, it starts to make no sense to us, actually, if we take it too literally. Because already he's tumbling over his own metaphors. He says it's like a precious jewel, like a jasper, but it's clear as crystal. Jasper and crystal are different things, but they're both beautiful. So he's trying to help us reinforce the beauty of the place. He continues on, and he says, it had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates. And on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And there were 3 gates on the east, 3 in the north, 3 in the south, 3 in the west. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Okay, the number 12 pops up 4 or 5 times in this little paragraph. The number 12 we bumped into in the first couple of weeks, and it is given to us as being, it's the number for the government of God. And he's already explained to us what that is. The 12 apostles, the 12 tribes of Israel, these are the main, that's the infrastructure of the 2 covenants that God made, Israel and the church. And the number 12 is key and indispensable within the construction of both of those communities. So the 12 is the government of God's the number of God's government, his vice-regency, the infrastructure of his leadership is symbolized to us by the number 12, because this doesn't give us an engineering plan of how this city is actually constructed. He's trying to explain to us the theology and purpose and meaning of what the city is actually about. Okay, so he's trying to explain to us it's about the government of God, the leadership of God. God's dominion is over everything, but it's still a city and it's a place. So he continues to try and explain it to us. So we'll keep going. Then the angel who talked to me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates and walls. Okay, remember last week I mentioned when somebody measures something in the scriptures, it's not necessarily to find the exact statistical dimensions. It's to teach us about the theology and the purpose and the identity of what it is that is being measured, right? This goes all the way back to Ezekiel and Isaiah and Zechariah and now into Revelation. Okay, so what does he do? What does he measure? The city was laid out like a square, as long as it was wide. He measured the city with the rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length and as wide and as high as it is long. Right, so just stop right there. So he measures this city. It's as long as it is high as it is wide, and it's 12,000 stadia. 12,000 stadia in our measurements is about 1,300 miles. So the city is meant to be 1,300 miles wide and high and long. So how do you have a city the shape of a cube, 1,300 miles high? Right? This is a hard thing to understand or imagine, and what's the point? Because it's unlike anything that we can get our minds around. Okay, again, it's real. I don't think it's literal. Here's what he's trying to do, I think. He's using the number 12,000 in the way that we've seen him use other numbers before. The number 12, the number of God's government. The number 1,000 is this number of complete vastness. It's a great many, multitudinous number. The number of fullness. So what he's saying to us is this city is huge. It's massive. It's not, specifically 1,300 miles long or wide. It's just this vast dominion of God's leadership. And the strange part about the detail is he says it's a cube. It's as wide as it is high as it is long. What's the deal with the cube? Well, the original Hebrew readers would know exactly what he's talking about. There's one other place in Scripture that we're told about a cube. It's a room that is a cube shape. And it is in the temple. If you went to the temple, there's this room at the center, the very fulcrum of the whole place is called the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies in the temple is shaped like a cube. It is 20 by 20 by 20. And it is the place of God's presence. It is where the Shekinah, heavy presence of God comes once a year to meet the priest on the Day of Atonement. And so the Hebrews reading this would know this massive city that's shaped like a cube, that means that now there's no temple with a secret room. Now everything is the place of God's presence. Everywhere is the place of God's glory. God's Shekinah heavy presence is upon all things and all people, and we're covered with this. Why? Because the cube imagery teaches us that, I think. Because there's only one other place in Scripture where that's mentioned. This image is profoundly reinforced by the next description. The angel measured the wall using human measurement, and it was 144 cubits thick. Okay, remember, 144, 12 times 12, he's just reinforcing the whole image of the whole thing is established as the government community of God, his leadership, his dominion, for us to lead with him in that. The wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. The foundations of the city wall was decorated with every kind of precious stone. First foundation was jasper, second sapphire, agate, emerald, onyx, ruby, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, turquoise, jacinth, and amethyst. These 12 precious jewels. Now again, John's not giving us here the engineering plan for what actually is the footings and foundations. He's teaching us about the theology of what it means to live in this city. So what do these 12 jewels mean? Well, it's exactly the same as what we've just covered in the Holy of Holies. The high priest, once a year in the Old Testament would go into the temple and he'd wear a breastplate, and on the breastplate there was 12 precious stones. 12 precious jewels, each one representing a tribe of Israel. The imagery being that the high priest would represent and bring the nation into God's presence and would affirm the atonement, and there would be absolution and forgiveness given to the nation through the mediation of the high priest. And then the people would celebrate because they had been forgiven and blessed for another year. And so the same imagery is being used here, but John is saying now it's not one guy with a special breastplate in a secret room. Now it's everyone, everywhere. We are all represented. We are all atoned for. We are all covered. And there is this beautiful forgiveness and atonement and healing and this luminous glory to the place that is, John is trying to help describe it to us, but again, he's running out of metaphors and words. He's using every available piece of theology that he can. By the way, this whole chapter is the New Testament version of Isaiah chapter 60. If you haven't read Isaiah 60 in a while, I'd encourage you to do that. It's Isaiah's own view and vision of this, right? And he adds a whole other little beautiful layer of details and other things to it. So Isaiah 60, that John is leaning on that as well, I think, as he's describing it. So we continue on, and he says the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each gate was made of a single pearl. All right, again, you can't take that too literally, or else it just gets weird, right? Because these pearls would have to be like 72 feet high. So how big is that oyster, right? And how do you catch it? And how do you open it? And where does it come from? And if it actually said earlier there's no sea, but then you've got oysters, where do they grow? So if we get literal, it gets really odd. But if you see it as symbolic, it's like John is just trying to say it's stunning and it's beautiful and it will blow your circuits because it is the fullness of God's gracious creativity unleashed in a brand new way upon all that he has made, and it is blessed, and it's like the Holy of Holies is everywhere. The great street of the city was gold, as pure as transparent glass. Again, that doesn't work. Gold isn't transparent, but now it seems to be, so we'll just take it that it's incredible. Whatever it is, it's beautiful, and it is like living and glowing. He says, I did not see a temple, and this is a bit of a punchline to the whole chapter. I did not see a temple in the city because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. There you go. God is now, the cosmos is now God's living cathedral. And he is everything in it. And he has it all covered with his presence. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light. Okay, you notice it says the city doesn't need the sun and the moon. He doesn't say there is no sun and moon. He just says we don't need them like we used to, because God's brightness is so strong. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. Okay, let's hit the pause button right there. This is an important verse. The nations will walk by its light, and then the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. This is important. This is actually a little twist in the whole story of Revelation. In the Revelation, the nations can be understood in two different ways. The first way, which is good, is the nations are those which will be reached and gathered to God, right? It talks about that a lot. Every tongue and tribe and people and nation, the nations will be reached and gathered by the missionary endeavor of the church. The other way that nations is used in Revelation is of the rebellious multitudes against God, the people who fight against God's purposes, the nations. So we're told the beast and the prophets would come up out of the sea. What is the sea? The seas are the nations. That's what we're told. And so there's this double use of nations, but we're told here that the nations will come and live by the light of the city. But then, even twistier, we're told that the kings of the earth will bring their tribute, will bring their treasure, their honor, their glory into the city. The kings of the earth is a phrase that's used, I think, 6 or 7 times in Revelation, and every time it's used in chapter 1, 6, 16, 17, 18, 19. Whenever it's used, it is describing to us the human leaders of hostility, the rebel leaders of that which is against God's people, the persecutors of the church, the kings of the earth. That's the title that they're given. When we read about the beast and the false prophet and the dragon, those are the supernatural powers behind the systems, the evil power behind the system. The kings of the earth, though, are actually the human players that are the human leaders of the enterprise against the church. So what's happened here? Because we would expect at this point the kings of the earth, if that phrase is being used the way it has been the whole way through Revelation, we would expect the kings of the earth to be in the lake of fire right now. But we see them walking into the city, bringing all of their wealth and glory and honor and all their crowns and everything they've got. They bring it and they lay it before God. What just happened? Well, there's this twist that you might not see coming, but it's written right there in the text. What do we do with that, and how do we understand it? Well, Isaiah 60 sheds a little bit more light on it, so if you want to read that for yourself, that's a good place to go and be a student of the moment. But actually, depending on what we see the purpose of the lake of fire is, will depend on how we can interpret who the kings of the earth are and what they're doing in this city whose gates are never closed. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night here. And we keep going. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. So again, we're given this idea of identity, judgment, consequence, embrace, exclusion, and yet the gates are never closed. Later on, we read in chapter 22 that there's a tree in the center of the city, and it has leaves that are on it all the time, and the purpose of the leaves are for the healing of the nations. Again, this imagery of the nations are broken, the people are hurting, and they need to be healed, and there's something of the fountain of New Jerusalem's ministry that heals the nations. So how do we understand all of that in light of judgment, consequence, and blessing? Well, that's for us to find out in the future, because there have been brilliant minds who have put all their attention to this and come up with different versions of how this works. And so it's a great endeavor for us to give ourselves opportunity to read and ponder and pray and try and understand what are the purposes of God. How does this work out, and what is my role in this beautiful adventure? Okay, we can see, though, from the whole story that there is now no more curse. Everything that is wrong and broken in the world and in creation is made right. That tears are dried, injustice is put an end to, mercy and justice are poured out. All the violence is gone, all the fear is gone, all the shame is gone, all the self-consciousness and awkwardness and regret, all those things are gone. We are fully right with ourselves and with each other and with God and with creation. All that was broken in the Garden of Eden is restored and redeemed in the New Jerusalem.